Yeah, welcome back from lunch. I hope everybody has coffee, lots of coffee, because you will be asked to ask questions in a few minutes. And the panel we're going to have here, the title is Internet Technologies and Democracy. Well, it's not the first time that this kind of topic has been discussed in public, but my hope is that we can debunk some myths about the internet and especially you here on the panel. But first, let me tell you something about the that we're going to talk about. What I'm interested in, what we are interested in, the editorial board, what we thought about this panel was when you look back in the good old times in the internet, then you could have the impression that everything was better these days. The beginning was good, there was the possibility for grassroots. There was a grassroots laboratory all over the net. You could gather in chat rooms, you could build up new communities and so on. And you could do it all by yourself. And it was the promise of democracy. And this promise has not been redeemed, to quote ourselves from yesterday. Instead, it was quite the opposite. When you look at the internet today, you have, in Germany, you would say, einen vermachteten Raum, fully a space which is kind of filled with power strings and corporations, the power of state, and let's say maybe even a quite helpless individual consumer in the center of it. Doesn't know what to do against Facebook and Google instead of using it and being part of it. So when we look at the rise of artificial intelligence, big data, and all big corporations, the question is, can we still understand the internet as a political place? Is there still hope for democracy in the internet? Is it a tool for democracy, a place for civil society and democratic public? If so, how can politics shape the internet, or the other way around? How can the internet shape politics, and which effect could this all have on the analog world? I'd like to discuss that with the panel participants, which I would like to introduce shortly. On the very right from your perspective, there's Kathrin Passig. She's a German author, also for Eurozine. She won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize 2006. And actually, I'm just naming this prize also because I'm not sure what you're doing right now. Maybe you can say something additionally if I'm missing something out. Articles on Eurozine carry the title "The Black Box is a State of Mind or Commonplaces of Technology Critique," and I advise you to read those if you haven't done yet. My personal perspective is whenever I read a text by Kathrin, my view on the digital world is not the same. The upcoming book is Invent New States, How Politics is Done or is created in the internet, and will be published next year. And I think what we hear today is partly taken from the book, or a thesis that will be also published in the book. In the center, Andrei Soldatov, Russian investigative journalist and co-founder of Agentur.ru. I understood that you see yourself, like Agentur.ru, as an watchdog of the Russian surveillance state, the secret services. You have published many articles in the Foreign Affairs, not Policy, The Atlantic, or both? Both, fantastic. And also the book, I just want to name one, The Red Web, The Struggle Between Russia's Digital Dictators, and another one, The New Online Revolutionaries, which was updated 2017 after the election in the United States and the Russian, well, you will tell me more, ask more about it, but how the Russians intervened into these elections. And finally, Rachael Jolley, editor of the award-winning journal Censorship. You have correspondents all over the world, and you yourself have an experience of being a journalist and an editor for 20 years. You published in actually most of the British magazines and newspapers. And what was new to me when I prepared for this was that you also co-wrote a play, which is called Murdering the Truth, and nothing could be closer to this topic. So ask you first, Rachel, just to give us a short introduction to the question if we're looking at a crime scene right now at the internet, where the truth is the victim.
Thank you, Daniel. As some of you know, who know me, know that I'm very fond of tea. In fact, I'm being commissioned to write a piece for Miha already. So today I'm going to talk about 3 T's: transparency, trust, and why terms and conditions apply. The overarching questions here that I'd like to talk about are: what is the democracy that we want, and what is the technology we want to achieve that? In other words, how can we make it happen? So I'd like to take you a little bit into the past. Long, long ago, sometime in the 1990s, I was a journalist and I was taken to the BT Labs in Ipswich, which is in the eastern part of England, where they were developing something they called the House of the Future, where they said the washing machine would be able to talk to you and you could talk to everything. And the lab guy said, it will be great. We'll know what you're wanting to buy and when it's on sale. And if you're out of it, someone will call you on the phone. And I said, that sounds really creepy. And they were like, no, that sounds amazing. And I think they went off and talked about how weird I was over in the side of the room. But it came to pass. And it wasn't the phone that called, but social media and the internet that knew what I wanted. And the phone call was often a pop-up ad. And I still think it's a bit creepy, because the only person I really want to know if I'm out of milk or if I want to buy a bed is really me. One friend even told me that Google knew he had multiple sclerosis before he did. Ads for the MS Society kept popping up when he was online, and he started to wonder why. And it was scanning emails and so on, and he was, in fact, Google was right, and he did have MS. So right now, Google's hoovering up our data, as I hope we know, who we email, what we search for, what we want to buy. Not just Google, but Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also entertainment companies like Netflix and the BBC, who line up a set of programs that they know we want to watch, even though we haven't even heard of them yet. And basically, they're offering to take away decisions from us by letting them do it. They're saying it's tough out there, so may we choose you a book, a film, a life, a friend who you don't even know yet, someone who agrees with you maybe. And pretty soon you will realize that you don't have any choices left because someone else is making them for you. But actually, in many ways, this is also not new. In 2006 to 2010, I worked for a think tank that was pretty close to the UK government at the time. And it was well known that when Number 10 wanted to know what society was thinking, buying, feeling, sort of taking a societal snapshot, they talked to the supermarkets, because back then the supermarkets were seen as the leaders in collecting data. They knew if people were buying rom-coms or if they were spending less on their weekly shop, and if they were stocking up on tins because they thought there was going to be an economic crisis, and government would turn to them to find out what people were thinking. So back then and now, supermarkets were gathering data from loyalty cards. Then Google and Facebook realized we could give them loads of information if they created something and offered it to us for free. And so they did. And it was our choice. We chose free email when paid was an option. Other alternatives were and still are available. We chose a search engine that tracks our data. We chose to add our date of birth and our photos and our holiday details to Facebook, maybe. And for a lot of people, they handed them over without questioning why. And you may remember, like I do, reading one of those terms and conditions documents for the first time. I have a really clear memory of this and where I was, and just looking at the document and then realizing just what I was giving away, that this application was going to be able to read my emails and look at my photos and do all these other things. And I think on that occasion, I just said, no, I'm not going to use that app. But we just got used to it, and we just handed over all these rights for free without reading documents. And because the deal was you can't have the thing unless you click yes, so we did. And why is this a democratic issue? The thing is, in a democracy, we have a responsibility to make decisions as well as to be informed and be represented. And in democracy, we need to decide more rather than have decisions thrust upon us. And in giving away our data, we didn't realize that all that information would be collated into huge data banks, where people could work out things like, this person with a car is far more likely to vote for Trump, so let's focus on all these people who have cars because they might vote for Trump, rather than all the people who use public transport. Let's forget about them. And from there, all those people with cars were targeted, and so around the US election there was a lot of direct messaging going on, as we all probably know by now. All this data analysis about what people did with their lives is basically now used to target people with messages, as was done in the run-up to also to the Brexit referendum. But I think transparency is so important in a democracy, and it means that we know what the impact of our decisions are. I want to know what my government is doing on my behalf, and I also want transparency from companies operating in my country that may have impact on that democracy. I want to trust that the political system is working and then it's not being driven by shadowy figures and ideas that are hidden from view. So transparency of who we allow to access our data and have a personal contract with is really important for the future. And so it must be part of our future democracy that we know what we're signing up for, and the companies have to make that clear. So we take back that decision-making process. We also need more transparency about what political parties in an election period are saying to voters. In previous decades, we knew what arguments were being made to different parts of the electorate because we saw the billboards, or we saw the TV ads, or we saw the newspapers, or we saw the interviews. But what we're increasingly now seeing is hidden messages and hidden politicking. The electoral bodies need to catch up with those digital leaps and make some changes to what is allowed in election periods, I would argue. I'm going to argue that each campaign needs to lodge one example of messages or campaigns with the electoral body. And that's something that I think is now being talked about with the Electoral Commission in the UK. So whether those messages are on Facebook or on the side of the road, they're lodged with the Electoral Commission in the UK, so other people can see what those messages are, and they'll be able to challenge them. They'll be able to talk about them, and they'll be able to check them, and they'll be able to oppose them. Because the democracy should be a noisy, open society where there's disagreement and argument and space to do it. And that more transparency breeds more trust. And that's something that politicians and political systems need in order to operate. Because if no one believes in the system, then it fails. Democracy must supply its own terms and conditions, ones that create structure for rights and responsibilities, both for its citizens and for corporations operating within it. These include paying tax, living within the laws of the lands, and supporting its essential freedoms. We do not want to hand over the right to choose what we're allowed to see or read or hear to unelected Silicon Valley corporations. We should not be happy with the governments that try to do that and suggest that massive California-based companies should be selecting the news or views for us. We should be making those choices for ourselves. At Index, we've already heard of videos, for example, that were taken down of the Rohingya Muslims being persecuted after pressure from the Burmese government. What this is attempts to undermine evidence gathering by human rights organisations. We hear about Facebook taking down watchdog groups in the US. We hear of numerous issues where the Chinese government, of course, attempts to stop its citizens from having access to books and articles and news items on the internet, and is even going as far as giving people a social media score, which then is gives them a score which then means that they're allowed privileges or have privileges taken away. These are governments pressurising social media and digital companies to act in a certain way to censor or restrict access. And in other nations, governments seem to want to hand over those decisions to social media rather than reviewing the law and going back through this democratic process. And back to those terms and conditions, I think we need terms and conditions document that run to a lot less than the 30,000 words that some of them do, which is basically the size of a book that is really clear that no one's going to read before they click on. This is not a document designed for people to read or understand. Simple, straightforward contracts need to replace this culture of hidden meanings designed to mystify and mislead. We should know what we're signing up for with our new era of democracy and the technology that goes with it. We need technology that works to help us be informed, be curious, to connect, and of course we should remember that these tools do exist for good, but they can also be misused to surveil and suppress.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, I would like to go a bit further into the state perspective, so to say. And we know a lot about 5 years ago, Edward Snowden helped us to understand what's going on in the United States in regard to the surveillance state. But I'm sure Andre can tell us more about the Russian situation and how it might be even different or more or less the same.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And let me start with one thing. We need to understand why actually we are talking about Russia. What makes Russia so special on the internet? Why we have all these discussions today about disinformation, information campaigns, fake news, and it's inevitably it leads us to the question about the Russian and Kremlin's approach to the internet. So what is so special about the Kremlin's ideas of the internet? And to be honest, let me start with something you are all familiar here, with words. For many years, I would say for 20 years, there was a big dispute between the Russian cyber experts, government experts, and Western experts of the way how to talk about the internet. So the Western experts always insisted to use cyber as a word. They loved cyber warfare, cyber security, cyber offensive, anything about cyber, because they wanted to talk about cables and computers. The Russians wanted to talk about information. And all documentation and all legislation they suggested for the United Nations, for all these international bodies, they have insisted to have information security, information warfare, information offensive, information weapon. And why is that? Well, the reason is that the Kremlin and the Russian security services, they believed that the biggest threat is coming not from cables or computers, they believed that the biggest threat is posed by the content. And that's why we have information. It had some basic, I would say, it had some legacy from the Soviet Union, and it's based on actually on something the Russian security services inherited back from the KGB. I remember in 1996, when I just joined my first newspaper, I was assigned to go to the Russian State Duma, Russian Parliament, to the very first hearings about the internet. And the room was full by scientists, and mostly by people from Russian scientific institutes and research centers, and they promoted the idea that the government should give more money, more funding for building scientific networks and for networks to connect all Russian scientific institutions. And all of a sudden we got a deputy head of the Russian electronic intelligence on the stage. And he was very blatant and very laconic. He said, the internet poses a threat to national security of Russia. That was it. That was his message. So the Russian security services, from the beginning, they considered the internet and they wanted to think of the internet in terms of threats. What kind of threats they pose for the Russian stability, national security. You can pick up any name you want. But to be honest, it was quite fine until the late 1990s. And still, the internet in Russia was relatively free, and the Kremlin was actually didn't care a lot about the internet regulation. We didn't have any information wars online until we got a really big crisis. And that was the moment, by chance, that we got Vladimir Putin on the stage. We got the second Chechen War. And it was a very defining moment for many things in my country, including, actually, the fate of democracy. But it also was a very important moment for the Russian internet. Putin invested his personal prestige in that war. He wanted to win it. But the problem was that a lot of Russians, they didn't feel this way because the Russian army, failed miserably, first in Afghanistan, then in the first Chechen War. So the first thing that Putin needed to do, he needed to find an explanation why this time it would be absolutely different, and to give an explanation to the Russians why we lost the first Chechen war. And he easily found this explanation. He said that it's actually because of the journalist. The journalist, Russian corrupt journalist and Western journalist, undermined the Russian war effort in Chechnya, and they forced us to lose the war and give and leave Chechnya. And to be honest, this message was sort of accepted by the Russian people, because by that moment, most of the Russian journalists were seen as corrupt by the population. People actually fed up with journalism back then. And that eased the way for the Kremlin to accept a new legislation and new ideas about how actually to control the information space, as we call it, in Russia. And that was the moment we got with information security idea. And in 2000, Putin, actually just few months in office, he already signed the so-called doctrine of information security. And you can find everything in this document. It's quite a remarkable thing. For instance, you can find the idea that one of the threats to the Russian information space is posed by hostile media, which try to interfere and dominate the Russian psychosphere, something like that. Back then, it was, of course, about television and foreign media, but it was also about the internet. And that was the moment the Russian security services started thinking that they need to control the content. Also because the Second Chechen War was the very first war in Russia when you see the adversary, back then it was about Chechen militants, using extensively and very successfully websites. They launched a lot of websites, and for the Russian government it was really difficult to take them down, because most of these websites were based somewhere. Some of them in Sweden, some of them in Georgia, some of them in the United States, foreign ministries, and a lot of desperate requests to take them down. Nobody complied. It was a real problem. So many things started back then. Patriotic hackers started back then, because when the government failed, the Russian security services came up with the idea that you can use some proxies, some people who might attack independent media or independent websites, and it would be fine for the government because you can always deny your responsibility. It would be not about you, it would be about someone else, about patriotic guys. As I said, it was a defining moment. The problem what we got right now is it's this dispute about the terminology lasted for many years, right until 2016. And even in 2015, when we published our book, The Red Web, I remember all my conversations with the British experts and American experts, and they insisted of using cyber as a main word. They didn't want to talk about information warfare. And when we got 2016, and everything changed. Just everything. I got lots of people, my friends from American cyber companies and British cyber companies, and experts, government experts and private experts, saying that, look, probably Putin was right. Probably he was right thinking that the biggest threat coming off the internet is not some hacking attack. It's the information or disinformation, which is actually the same thing. We need to find a way to deal with the content. And we need to find a way how to talk about this properly. So maybe it's time for us to change the terminology. Maybe we need to forget about cyber. Maybe all of us, we need to accept the idea of information warfare. To be honest, I think it's a very dangerous idea, because maybe the Kremlin is not so skillful, not so good, and they made a lot of mistakes, but they sort of forced us to accept the Kremlin language of talking about the internet. And I think it's really dangerous, because still the internet is not all about the threats. Of course, there are a lot of threats and a lot of problems, but it's also an opportunity, and it still is. And that actually brings me to the question, which is one of the most paradoxical questions we have right now. Why is why he has been so successful in the West? And why, I mean, in terms of using the internet, and why he was so unsuccessful inside the country. And let me start with the second one. It's quite clear that, yes, we have a lot of repressive legislation. We have a very extensive surveillance system in Russia, much more totalitarian what we have, what you have in the West, because actually it's all pervasive and it's very aggressive. But still we have space for debate. Still we have Russian opposition leaders recording videos, and they have millions and millions of hits. Still we have people talking quite honestly about what's going on in the country online. And the most important thing is that still the source of information about the thing the government wanted to hide, for instance, the Russian military presence in Ukraine, or this disaster in the UK, I mean, the attempt of poisoning Skripal, or MH17, the details about that. The source for this information is the internet, social media primarily, because even the Russian soldiers, they are users of social media, and sometimes if they get provoked or excited, they post a lot of damaging information about them, like where they are, what they just did with some Ukrainian guy, and that's a source of information for journalists. So it looks like this technology, which was built to spread information, and that is, well, it's really difficult to curtail. If you need to control information online, it's a big problem. But the problem here is, in terms of technology, information and disinformation is just one thing. So outside the country, I mean abroad, of course, it was quite easy, relatively easy, for the Kremlin to use the same technology to spread this information. And here is the question: why it's about Russia? What makes Russia so special? And to be honest, it's I think for me the answer is the Soviet legacy. The Soviet regime and Soviet authorities, by definition, they had a very interesting attitude to people they governed. Actually, they despised the Soviet people. If you look at all this history of limitations and documentation and legislation we used to have in the Soviet Union, it would strike you how many of all kinds of limits a Soviet citizen had. And the reason was that the Soviet authorities believed that any Russian Soviet citizen could in any moment go drunk or go mad or break something or go in contact with a suspicious official. So he cannot be trusted even with a very limited room of free will. The KGB went even further. Actually, if you talk to a former KGB guy, or, well, now it might be about the FSB, because actually it's the same thing. These guys are extremely cynical, and it is about the motivation they see behind any moves, any activities of people who try to do something. If you ask them what do you think, what drives, what makes great, I don't know, Navalny or Soviet dissidents, the explanation they would provide would be something like, well, maybe his wife wanted to buy a new car. That's why he wanted to, I don't know, to move out of Russia, or that's why he tried to send his book to the West, because he wanted to make some money. And the general explanation was that everybody is corrupt. In the 2000s and in 2010s, Putin actually made this Russian national ideology that nobody could be trusted. Literally nobody. And it's a widespread thing in Russia these days. So nobody trusts trade unions in Russia, nobody trusts politicians, nobody trusts political parties, nobody trusts parliament. You have only one guy you can trust, and, well, Vladimir Putin, and you have the population, and nothing in between. And that makes things really easy for the Kremlin, for Putin, inside the country, because in this case you have only one guy, you have no choice, and that's it. And of course, he would love to have the same situation in other countries, because if you have a collection of strong people, like, I don't know, what we had in the 30s, that would make things really easy for him. So what he's trying to do, he's trying to export this cynicism and this mistrust in any kind of institutions to the West. Of course, I would never say that he invented this thing or he creates a narrative. Of course, it's not that. It just tries to exploit something which you already have in your societies. That's all. But he's quite successful in that.
Thank you very much. And there was the term trust again, and we'll come back to that. But before that, I would like to go deep inside the core cell of the internet, like to the beginnings. I understood that you, Kathrin, saw the internet the first time in 1993, if I'm correct.
Or I think it was 94.
94, okay. And at these times, there was maybe something during lunch we talked about the dissident times in Russia when the kitchen was the place where people discussed for two reasons. Because the radio was there, and the second reason, it was the place where you could hide your conversation best towards the neighbors. Nobody listened there. Now, if I want to compare maybe 1994, the chat rooms, maybe they were kind of the kitchens in the internet, the place where people gathered and they talked about things. Was that the democratic place of the internet that we still seek?
I've got problems with that whole history of the internet that you narrated in the beginning, but I'll come to that later. First, I'd like to make a technical announcement because I can see 10 people sleeping from here, and we'd rather prefer for you to get up, go outside, buy coffee, come back. I'm afraid the coffee machine isn't working, which is really a bad thing to have right after lunch. I'd suggest for the Berlin conference to have coffee after lunch. But please do get up and walk outside, go get coffee and come back. We prefer that to looking at your struggle to stay awake. I've got a theory about this cyberspace thing because it went a little bit different in Germany. People used cyberspace in the 90s subculture, and then it disappeared. It was an old, stupid word that no one used except Bundeswehr. The army started to use it a couple of years ago, and my theory why they did that is because it has space in it, and space has borders, and they feel comfortable with that concept of cyberspace as an actual space that needs an army to protect it and to defend its borders. And that's why they like that notion. I don't know how that ties in with your theory. Anyway, it was kind of you to say that the book is going to come out next year, because it isn't, at least not that I know of. Not sure how my topic ties in with the others at all, but I'll try to explain where I come from, and then maybe we'll be able to find some common ground later. I started thinking about the internal workings and the politics and policies of online communities after I had seen quite a lot of them come and go in a short time. And it always follows a similar pattern. People come together and they had an email list in the 1990s, and then maybe a forum around 2000, and maybe now it would be a Facebook group, something like that, and things work quite happily for a while, and they like each other and there are no problems at all, and then it all falls apart, and people try to after they've had arguments for about 2 years, they all go and found different new communities and think they're not going to make the same mistakes again, but of course they are. So that's what made me think about the history of democracy, because of course there had to be some time where there was no concept of democracy, no institutions, and people had to make it all up as they went. And I thought that's probably what's happening on the internet. And it would be useful to use that as some sort of lab where you can see what's going on in these proto-democracies, where people don't even think of what they are doing as being politics at all, but they have to make up some sorts of politics and institutions. And I thought, because it happens so quickly on the internet, because there's so much churn and communities come and go, it would be helpful to try and learn something from what happens there and transfer that to traditional politics. After a while, I noticed there are several problems with that idea. One of them is people do not think about democracy or about political structures at all in these communities usually. And if they do, and if they come to some conclusions, and if they find out what works and what doesn't, the next group will not learn from that group. There are interesting reports about the mailboxes of the 1970s that describe exactly the same problem that we see now in Facebook groups and wherever communities are right now. It's been the same for 40 years, so there's really not that much of a change when it comes to the political problems that these structures have to deal with. A second problem being that there isn't much democracy in online communities at all. There's a quote by Edward Castronova, who is an extremely interesting researcher that no one has ever read. I only found his name and some footnote after I'd been interested in the topic for about 5 years, so I don't know why no one reads him. He's written a few great books about online communities, and he said something similar like, there is no democracy at all in online communities, not the tiniest bit. It's all little islands of dictatorship in a sea of anarchy. So there's really not much that you can learn about democratic structures because they're just not there, and they're not. And that's not because Facebook and Google ruined the internet. They haven't been there in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, because democracy is not as popular as we would like it to be. It's complicated. It's no fun at all, and people try to avoid it at all costs. Most of the structures you can usually find somewhere on the net are more like monarchies. Some king or queen decides on just about anything, and maybe there's a little group that surrounds that person. But if there is any semblance of democracy, it's usually not much more than that. People trying to have some facade to make it look more democratic than it actually is. I suspect that democracy might be fractal, but there's actually not surprisingly little research on that. So if anyone has an opinion about that, I would love to hear it. I suspect the political structures you use in your everyday life, in your Facebook group about how to take care of hamsters, are the political structures that you will find familiar and try to work with in larger structures or in the world outside of your hamster Facebook group. This all looks a bit less optimistic than I hoped it would be when I started to do research on that largely unwritten book. I think there are some slivers of hope or reasons for a little bit of hope, and one of them is if we stop discussing the shortcomings of Facebook at every single one of these conferences, because I do go to a lot of conferences that are concerned about what Facebook does, what Google does. And of course it is important to look at that, but if we look at what's happening on the micro-political level, that's a word Sally mentioned the day before yesterday, I like it. I think that would help because we can only talk about the politics of these communities if we are willing to recognize the things that happen there as politics, not just as some weird fun people are having in Facebook hamster groups. These are political decisions that are being made there, and they're being made by us, not by others, not by Facebook. Of course, there are political decisions made within the Facebook headquarters, but we need to talk about the others as well. When we decide to use, I don't know how the Eurozine community is organized, when you decide to use an email list or a Slack chat or a chat within Facebook Messenger or whatever you decide to use, it is a political decision, and all the other structures that surround that decision have political consequences as well for the way this community is going to work. So I think there's hope in the concept of better institutions. Lawrence Lessig wrote in the 1990s that code is law, and that is an important concept because what Lawrence Lessig was trying to say was just that governments need to think about what happens when there is a casino on the internet, so that crosses borders, and you can't just regulate it within your country's borders. But that's not the only way that this code is law thing is important. It also means that whatever platform you decide on to use, that platform will influence whatever is going to happen on that platform for you. So there are specific kinds of arguments and of structures of arguments that will happen if you used the Usenet in the 1990s or an email list. Other kinds of problems that will crop up if you use something else. They're all specific to that decision you made right in the beginning because someone said, well, okay, let's use an email list. There have been small improvements. We don't have all the problems that people used to have in the 1990s with their communities. Maybe we've just exchanged them for different problems, but at least there has been, I would say, some small sort of progress towards maybe at least an idea of better institutions. And it's easy to talk about the fact that Facebook or Twitter are doing things wrong. But as soon as you want to have an informed discussion about what they should be doing instead, then you need to have thought about this whole history of political structures within communities in order to say what you want to have instead of that. Now I broke my promise and didn't say anything about your narrative, but for all I think it's in just about every invitation I get to attend a conference on the internet and democracy. It always says there was this golden age and it's over now, and that's why we need to talk about the things that we've lost. And I don't think it works that way. It is a convenient narrative for conferences, but I haven't done any quantitative research on that, but someone should actually try to find all the conference invitation emails from the last 20 years and see whether they weren't saying there's this lost paradise even in the 90s. The books definitely do that. When you read books about the internet in the late 1990s, they all talk about the lost paradise back then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But that's exactly what I'm trying to do, and maybe that's the link between you three. And that's what I would like to talk about, this kind of to debunk the myth that the internet is somewhere in the past a democratic place. Because what you described now is three different perspectives on the internet now and in history. Looking at the corporations and looking at the state in Russia, and also looking at the small chat rooms at the beginning, and even Wikipedia. I mean, whoever tried to change a Wikipedia entry failed very quickly, probably, if the change is more than just putting a comma on a different position. So even Wikipedia, that is always held up as the grassroots institution in the internet, is not what it seems to be. And I think the link is, and I just want to throw in this question, and then open to the audience, because I'm really interested in the debate. The missing link for me here seems to be that if you talk about legitimation, if you talk about trust, if you talk about transparency, all these are political terms. These political terms are not used even in the smallest mailing groups when they come together. The first one who sets up a mailing group is the king or the queen, as you said. So I just want to quote or bring in a definition by Shoshana Zuboff. I mentioned her book before, but she is talking about, in regard to information war, she's talking about a pathological division of knowledge in the book Surveillance Capitalism. And the question she raises is pretty simple, but this question is kind of an analytical pattern to analyze in all these three groups that you mentioned, or spheres of the internet, if I may say so, to analyze what power means. And the power term doesn't appear very often. Control, you mentioned control region, which is related to power. And the question is, first, who knows, who decides, and who decides who decides? This question was raised by Kant already, in a way. Like, this is a kind of democratic, all democratic question. And my question is, before we then go and give the microphone to the audience, if you hear this, who knows, who decides, and who decides who decides? What is your thought about it? And maybe Andre, if I may start with you, even with the personal touch of the whole thing. I mean, you're a journalist, and when we emailed each other, you said you take it personal what happens in Russia because you don't want to be part of this information war. But what do you see as a defense mechanism in regard to this question? Just encryption can be the solution. What is the political solution if you look at it in terms of who decides, who decides?
Yeah, actually, I take it quite personal because I joined the internet like maybe 1993, 1992. One of the reasons was because my father actually brought the internet to Russia. He was one of 3 guys doing that. So it's quite a personal story for me. He launched the very first internet service provider in the Soviet Union. And that it's probably there. Again, I do not want to be so focused on the Soviet past, but unfortunately, it provides a lot of lessons for us, and also about the internet. And my answer probably is that I think the picture is a bit more complicated. You are absolutely right, being very suspicious and critical of what's going on right now on the internet, because it looks like, some people, we all know them, they started this thing out of very idealistic ideas they got in the 60s in California, and they wanted to build a very horizontal structures, and they never thought about, say, security, because there was no problem of trust, because everybody knew who they were, and they trusted each other, and that developed into something completely different. Now we have hierarchy, right? We have ranking. The video posted by you or posted by CNN would have completely different ranking. It's all about hierarchy. It's not about horizontal networks. And of course, the governments in many countries, from the United States to Russia to Europe, they found a way how to use these things. And right now, it's not only about actually dealing with hierarchy, but also of imposing some borders. That's why we have in the room this crazy talk about digital sovereignty, which sounds completely crazy and was first invented by Chinese and the Russians, but after Snowden revelations, a lot of people in Europe, and I remember Angela Merkel and the French President Hollande, both of them stated that now we need to build our own internet in Europe, which sounded a bit strange because all of us think of the internet as something really global. But I would say that there is a good thing, still there is a bright side to that. And maybe Russia is a very good example to that, because everything is very radical about Russia. So you are absolutely right talking about these things when you have a politically stable situation. When everything is calm and you have your president for 18 years and nobody expects anything to happen. In this situation, you have, and unfortunately, you don't see enough internet freedoms, and you have all these problems. But the nature of social media is that when you have any crisis, any kind of crisis, all of a sudden you have something special. You have the thing that in social media, content is generated by users, not by employees of a company which runs social media. And it's the biggest and the huge difference between the media, traditional media, and social media. The content generated by us. Maybe it would be, this content might be disinformation, might be stupid rumors and gossip. But when you have something really big, like a political crisis, like the Arab Spring, or you have a natural disaster, you have people generating this content, and that actually is is something the government still are struggling to find a way to deal with. Most of the systems of surveillance, not only in Russia, but also in the United States, they are designed and built to deal with few troublemakers. So they know, they have this list, and they know of people who might be potential troublemakers, and they keep this list and update this list, and they know how to follow them. But when you have a catastrophe in Kerch, or you have something happening in Sochi, or you have a natural disaster or terrorist attack, all of a sudden it's not about political activists. It's not about people who are already on some list. It's about people. And they provide information. And for the governments, it's almost impossible to cope with this amount of information because it's sudden. And I remember why I'm starting with the Soviet Union. But the very first time on my memory, it started in 1991. In 1991, when we got this coup d'etat in Moscow, and the KGB wanted to oust Gorbachev, and they brought tanks to Moscow streets, and they completely seized control over the old traditional media, and it was a victory from the first day. We had this tiny internet service provider run by my father too, and it was a very small network, but this network already connected most of our scientific institutions in the Soviet Union. And there was one guy, bright guy, just a guy, an engineer, who thought of a very small thing. He asked all guys in this network who were connected to look out of the window and to report back what's going on. That was it. And it was an instant picture of what's going on in the country, and immediately it was clear that the putschists, the KGB, were capable of bringing tanks only to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the rest of the country was not touched by this coup, and that gives hope to people, and people thought, wow, maybe it's not that serious. And when this information was passed on to the West, and CNN made a big thing, and then all of a sudden we understood, no, it's not that serious. We are dealing with something we can deal with. So when you have this kind of crisis, the internet is still what we dreamed back in the 80s and the beginning of 1990s.
Great. Yeah.
To try and give another answer to your question about who decides, because when you go back far enough in the history of actual traditional democracies, which isn't that far, you only have to go back to the 19th or early 20th century, sometimes late 20th century, then you always find that there is this, it's Geburtsfehler in German. Does anyone know the English word?
I don't want to translate this. Birth error, I don't know.
Something that is baked into the thing right from the beginning, that there is always this undemocratic moment when a democracy is born, that someone has to decide who is going to decide. You can't solve that in a democratic fashion. It's just not possible. So I feel uncomfortable when you describe the internet as some specifically some place that is specifically less democratic than the rest of the world. It isn't. It's just in a different stage of its democratic development. And when you look at the European democracies and the way they got rid of monarchies in the 19th century, it worked quite similar. When you read up on Wikipedia on the role that Jimmy Wales had in the beginning and the role that he has today, and the intermediate steps that led from here to there, it is quite similar to the process that monarchs, kings in the 19th century had to slowly cede some of their powers and enable democracy to do more than they used to. And there are these these large grey areas in between, sometimes lasting decades, where it isn't quite clear what the king can do and what he can't do, and what democracy should do and what they can do without being thrown into jail by the king, who finds out that he still can do that kind of thing. So the internet democracies are in the 19th century right now. They're only now finding out how things might eventually work, what institutions are needed for that to work, and we shouldn't hold it against them that sometimes, no, that actually in all cases there is an undemocratic decision who is going to decide who's going to decide.
Rachel, the murder case.
Okay.
What about democracy? Is it dead?
I'm going to have a short answer because I think lots of people have other things to say. Just to your question, do we care about democracy? I think that people do care about democracy, but they just use other words to describe that. So people definitely care about trust. And I hear this conversation about politicians a lot. No, I don't trust that person, or I don't trust that person. I think that person's doing a good job. You know, I think that is a description of what people caring about democracy. They also care about fairness, where systems are fair or are not fair, you know. So you see political movements arise because people just feel that what their opportunities that they get are not fair, or those opportunities are not available. So I think also in terms of tax and corruption, so in systems where people don't believe that tax is actually being used in the appropriate manner, i.e. for roads, for hospitals, but is being creamed off to be used by, you know, the Prime Minister for building a big house, they lose trust in the system, whether that's a democracy or any other system. So I think what we are seeing is people describing what they want from a democracy, but just using other words to do so.
Thank you. Now, who wants the microphone? In the back. And afterwards.
Always gets the microphone. Have you noticed that?
They're quicker. There's more heat up here, and then.
Thank you, Andre, Kathrin, and Daniel. Very interesting. But in the end, I got a little bit confused because you were kind of comparing democracy to the internet. And while democracy is a very specific way a state and a society is organized, and it's the whole thing, we're just comparing the internet, which is a public sphere or is a technique, but it can't be a democracy. It's just a way to influence democracy. Yeah. Good influence, bad influence, but you just can't say that in the internet or on the internet there are binding decisions in a hierarchical way for all people in all society, in or on the net. It's just confusing.
I'm sorry if I said the internet. Of course, there is no internet. There isn't even Facebook. There is not even one Facebook. Facebook is used very differently in different countries. And even within the same country, when you ask two different users about how they use Facebook in detail, you will get very different answers. So it's no use talking about the internet at all in this context.
I think what I'm saying is the way that the internet or different elements of the internet can be used to undermine democracy, not that it's democracy.
Well, let me say finally something positive. In countries like mine, I think that actually the internet actually contributes a lot to democracy, because then you have a lot of public spaces for having public debate restricted, then you have things with censorship, and you have you cannot go protesting, and you might be sent to jail and all this stuff. The only place left is actually the internet. Maybe the level of quality of this debate would be not very good, but scrutiny we have for many years we have this regime in the country, and the quality of public debate of course reflects the level of society, but still it's probably the only place where we can still have this conversation, and it's extremely important. Sometimes we tend to overlook these things, but it's extremely important in Iran, it's still extremely important in China, in Russia, and all sorts of countries.
I would say it's important in Germany as well. You don't have to go to Iran for that to happen.
If you look at the way memes are used in China, for instance, to challenge ideas, it's really creative, and it's a really interesting way of getting around the censorship that the government has put in place. And as they spread, and they can be very effective, I think, as forms of protest or spreading information.
I have the mic, so whoever got the handouts, he will have to wait. Sorry. You use the several words in your presentations that actually made me feel like Alice in Wonderland and thinking of the clouds. So you used space, you used infrastructure, you used public sphere, and you used democracy. So basically, you described internet as a parallel world to the physical one, which is on the cloud. But I was wondering, in this context, can we, I mean, and it is an initiative that has already started in Europe, that internet is actually a common good. And it's not only public space, but a common space that is commonly governed in a democracy, and that is treated like water or like natural resources. And can we discuss about internet in those terms? And then there is no need to legitimize who it belongs to. If it's a common good, then it's a common good, and then we can decide on who makes the rules. But also we can maybe see more clearly who is the king and who should be overthrown.
There's always someone that has a hand on the switch that can turn the server off. Even if you say it's a public good like water, there will always be someone in charge of that public good, so it's not that easy, I guess. I'm not sure this answers your question, but I think there's a trade-off usually when people say we want to create our own service, we don't trust Facebook, we don't trust the cloud, we don't trust anyone, we are going to run our own server and put our software there. That is one of the most common problems for projects to fail, because they have this person within their organization that can simply turn off the server, stop paying the bills, say the domain belongs to me and I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder. So there's always this trade-off, and I think that is one of the reasons why many people say, no, we are going to use Facebook, we are going to use some other platform, we're going to use someone that doesn't belong to any of us within the organization.
I would like to specify this question just because I think, and then immediately go back to the other, because we have this idea and we have open source software. Now, hardware is probably not so easy to be open source, to be amended, to be common good. But why has in the history of internet, though there is obviously the consciousness and the knowledge that this is not a democratic place or not the most democratic place, why has there never been a movement? And I would not follow Volker there with internet and democracy is the contradiction or doesn't go together. Why has there never been a movement of uneignung, of taking over, of democratizing it like we did with open source software? Why not open source hardware where a community has the server room and we decide as a community, as we do about housing or water, about who has entrance to which amount of server space and internet and so on? Why are we looking at the internet as consumers but not as citizens?
Well, actually, it's not true, because you have this new movement where started with cryptocurrencies. Actually, it's a very big thing in the Silicon Valley right now. You have companies which, by definition, that build horizontal things where there is no one master and there is no one guy with a switch. It's impossible. Actually, it's very profitable now, and it's a very big thing. These companies are extremely active, extremely aggressive, and they're building up these networks, which might be used not only because, not only for currency, but for all kinds of things. And I think it's actually it's a future in a way, because not only will be in control, but the main thing for these networks. And to be honest, I don't like this idea that somebody somewhere in some room have a switch. I think it's not true. It's never been true, actually. And from 1990, to be honest, 7, Clinton decided to give up control over ICANN, the company which he created a corporation, not a state department, to deal with domain names. And the internet is not built to have one switch. I remember constant talk about the switch, but someone has a switch. We just need to locate him and put pressure on him, which is not true. I mean, it's not a true thing. That's not how the system is built. Yeah, you can find someone in charge of a specific thing, but you always can move on and you move on and move on. What's going on with cryptocurrency? It's actually it's bad.
I was talking about specific things. When you have a specific project you're running somewhere, then there's always
You can leave. Okay, you can get with you all your audience and you can move
absolutely,
to
and that's
another platform.
and that's what happens all the time. And I think that's one of the main differences. Why I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea that there is no longer any difference between the online and the offline, because the one big difference is that there is unlimited territory. It's not as in the physical world where you have to discover America and then get rid of the people who already live there in order to try out a new form of government. You can simply leave and there is unlimited space in whatever way you want to interpret it for you to try something new.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem as well, because it means that people never try to find we talked about that during lunch. People are not very motivated to try and solve their to find a common solution to a problem, because you can always just split up and have two different projects from now on. There's no real, usually not a very good reason to battle it out and find a common ground. Unless there's something like a really powerful name like Wikipedia, you would want to split it up, because then someone will repeat the original name and you will just be the split off project that no one ever has heard the name of.
So the last time I think we had a major communication technology that was new, about 100 years ago, with broadcast and radio and TV. And by that time, in the UK at least, is absolutely part of that era where they banned people from broadcasting themselves, their license, and they introduced the public corporation, the BBC, which now became utterly dominant. So the question is, if we see the internet as a product of the neoliberal era, and we look at how it operates in a entirely neoliberal way, is it inherently the case that it's run in the way you describe, or could we run it as a commons in the way that people like Eleanor Ostrom described that I just heard about in a different era? Or is it something inherently about the internet that makes it this kind of capitalist neoliberal space?
I think by running it as a commons, you will not solve many of the problems that usually are talked about when people complain about Facebook or Twitter. The fact that it's run by commercial companies now doesn't really, if you decided to, for some reason you're lucky, you are saying, okay, we are creating a second Twitter, but this time as a commons. You would run into basically the same problems with free speech, with people being harassed. You would have to find solutions for that, and they are totally independent of the commons or not question. So while it might be possible, I'm not sure this would lead to me getting invitations to more optimistic conferences.
Just to reference your point about radio, I think one of the interesting things about the internet and digital technology at the moment is the way that it's freed radio in many ways from national restrictions. So you have the use of podcasts to that individuals can make themselves, that are growing in popularity, that basically negotiating away from national infrastructure, national legislation, and is often increasingly used for news in places, I think I mentioned this before, in places like Zimbabwe and China, where there is a restriction on information, and to get different types of information, different types of news for different communities, and I think that is a really good use.
I think what I sort of imply that in case of radio, diversity actually is a good thing. The big challenge for the internet, I think that it's not necessarily a good thing. So we have this big idea, which we got after Snowden, that all these global platforms are actually something really bad because it's so global, and everywhere you have Facebook and Google and Twitter dictating you what to do. The problem is that actually there is some big elephant in the room, which call it localization. And actually all of these platforms are extremely interested to localize the data, because it's not about computers, it's not about cables anymore, it's about the content and the way this content is generated and the way it's stored. So actually it's quite profitable for the companies to split and actually to have data generated by British and Britain and by French in France, and by definition in China, well, in Russia, in Zimbabwe, and Iran. And the problem is that it's not only about government pressure, it's a combination of these two things. So the government is interested to localize everything because we want to have a national legislation and they want to have their own internet, which should be absolutely different from, say, the Americans or the British or anyone else and something else. But it's also in the interest of the companies, actually. If I'm sitting in Moscow and I'm going to google.com, I end up in google.true, not because the government tells Google to redirect me to google.true, but just because it's the interest of Google. And instead of a very global sort of picture we used to have in the 1990s, we are going to the age where we have a very localized version of the internet, which I think actually could be really dangerous, because the internet was not about that. It was about global. And actually that was, sometimes we overlook this, but the global nature of the internet actually gives a lot of hope to people who live in the countries with problems. Like I would never, say, for instance, take my personal experience. And I'm an investigative journalist and I have some problems being published in my country. And the only way for me to get published actually is to find an American publisher. And I found it thanks to the internet. And I publish my stories because I can communicate and I can get them published somewhere, and then they can be translated into Russian by someone, and that's my way to get back to my audience. And that's true for many people. And we can lose it if we are going to this localization. And I think it's also something about the quality of debate we have. I remember this story about Chicago Tribune, how it was reformed in the early 2000s. When some bright people decided that to generate more profits from advertisement, Chicago Tribune should not only fire all people covering international news, but every neighborhood of Chicago should have its own Chicago Tribune, which is probably good for local shops. But is it necessarily good for the audience? I would doubt that. Maybe I have my perspective as journalist, but I still think it's a very tricky question. It's a big challenge.
Ich sehe da hinten ein Kopfschütteln. I see Mr. Shaking, you're shaking your head. Probably I would like to give you the mic because your hand was raised before. Then there's Simon. But in the back there was long. And afterwards, Simon.
Yeah, I shake my head because I have some other perceptions, and I found it a little bit contradictory. The ones I really support your notion, Kathrin, Passig, to find good or new ways for good institutions. I think that's a very important question. But to go over the question of common grounds and to make us more comfortable with the monopolies of Facebook, Google, Apple, or the big five, in my perspective, it's not the way, because these monopolies, which are now gaining global reach, at least in the Western sphere and in other spheres too, they are completely, in their inner architecture, completely authoritarian. And they are very much linked to the secret service and secret police system of their country where they belong to by law. And for me, if you're talking about democracy and good institutions, we have to challenge also this basic architecture instead of being calm and use it and being fatalistic to use it. There are wide ranges of democratic institutions, common goods and municipalities, as we talked yesterday, which are not part of the Google or Apple or whatever realm. And one approach of these companies is to get a grasp on these infrastructures, and we have to resist that. At least if we don't want to be a foolish, naive little entertainment slaves in the future, which is then the only difference which we have probably to the people within the social scoring system of China. Thank you.
institutions. I was talking about software, the platforms that you decide to build your project on. And sometimes I don't believe that there is much individual learning, that new people enter these projects every day, new people are being born, and you can't expect every single one of them to learn everything there is to learn about failing democracy on online platforms. Just the same as probably very few people in the room could explain the details of the political systems of their countries. We just rely on them. We don't necessarily know all the details. So if there is any progress, it is going to be in institutions because that we can use and rely on. Because I think it's an illusion to expect everyone to understand every detail of the political system on an online platform or in the outside world. I think there is always a trade-off, and we talk too much about the fact that Facebook is a company and they want our money or other people's money and our data, things like that. But maybe you remember the world before Facebook, which in Germany was only about 8 years ago, 10 at the most. And that meant that there were quite a lot of people that you couldn't really, that were not on the internet at all because the existing systems were too weird and complicated for them. And I think that is a common trade-off. I've yet to see an open source system that, well, I used to say my grandmother could use, but I can't say that anymore because I'm pretty close to grandmother age myself now. But also, it's unkind to grandmothers who are quite proficient users of the internet sometimes. Anyway, there are technical and social reasons why open source software usually favors a technical elite. And I think there is value to the fact that everyone and their grandparents have been on Facebook for the last 10 years in most countries. That's, yeah, I see you shaking your head, but it is. I think I'm annoyed by the. I know, but you can do a lot of things on Facebook. You can reach people you couldn't reach before, and we didn't have that before. People forget that, and I think it's an annoyingly elite position to say the world before Facebook was better when only the technically proficient could use the internet because it was cleaner, better, more democratic back then.
Simon was here before. And then I would say two more. Sorry, it's 3 o'clock. Yeah, you said before. You grab the microphone. It's not like the internet here.
So one concept we haven't heard about, I don't think, so far is artificial intelligence. We're talking about sovereignty and democracy online and in internet structures. Then I think we should also try to think through how AI is influencing our own understanding and our own practices of sovereignty, how we, i.e. users, citizens, relate to one another via artificial intelligence.
I don't have much to say. It's a good question.
Black box.
I've been talking so much already. Yeah. So you sure you don't want to answer?
I don't have a clear answer. I'm sorry. I think it's too early.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I can.
You have an answer. This is good.
No, I don't have an answer. Maybe you can translate the question in a slightly different way, because what we talked about is legitimation and transparency. And I know, Kathrin, that you have different observations on the software issue and the AI issue as a black box. But when we talk about AI, and I understand you, it's like there is a decision process, a decision-making process that is, in contrast to democracy, by far not transparent. Kathrin would argue that even our brain, if I remember correctly the text, doesn't work transparently. But when I speak out an argument, you can give me a counter-argument. When an AI tells us, okay, actually, if an AI tells us we should change our environment on the planet in a specific way so that the planet will survive, do we do it? Is it legitimate to have this decision, or is it legitimate
everything I could possibly say is already in the article that's in the book in your conference bags. So
that was Simon's intention to advertise the book. So 2 more back there, Mika and someone else. Now she's.
He's talking about good or bad thing about Facebook, but I will give you an example of Google Books. Google is a private company that had a huge, 6 years ago, had a huge, and I'm sure that you are all aware of it, huge project of digitizing books. They had digitized millions of books that are public goods from public libraries. That project stopped, and these digital copies are private ownership of the Google company or Google corporation, and it's taken out of the public realm. So I'm talking about public common goods as a public good, which is controlled by the public. And when I compared that to water, what I meant is that you cannot privatize water in certain countries, but in certain countries like Italy or France, you can do that. And then the public doesn't have access to that. And I was talking about internet in that respect. And I wasn't talking about Facebook as an elitist or a popular tool. I was talking about the control and the public responsibility of those companies. So, and I didn't get the answer from you. And I'm really now worked up, so I will stop.
I'm sure you also know why the Google Books data are inaccessible now. Yeah, I mean, they're not inaccessible because Google is a private company. They're inaccessible because authors sued Google. That's why we can't. No, I didn't. Certainly didn't.
Anyone else last? Here. Sorry. Sorry.
I just want to follow up Simon's thing here. There's another structural technological thing about democracy, and that's the length of the articles. I mean, we are all journals publishing essay length, and with the shortened attention span that's coming up now with this social media, messaging culture, all these different things, there is, I think maybe this is something from Rachael or Daniel, which is publicizing. Are you, when you are at internet, shortening the article, which is maybe making the critical judgments shorter, and maybe we are losing something here? I'm just wondering if you feel like with the internet culture that we are losing some democratic judgment here by technology.
So some data from Pew Research that says something 66% of people that they surveyed see Facebook as a news source, and only a third of them actually open the story. So I guess there's something about people not reading very far. But I think Miriam, said something yesterday about the myth of the short attention span, so she might know a lot more about that. But I think that long-form journalism is actually, there's a lot of signs that long-form journalism is coming back, so I don't think we should be shifting away from it, because I think there's an appetite for longer, more detailed things that people feel like they're not getting from Twitter, maybe. And so I think, we're seeing the rise of book sales, for instance, again, which I think is an encouraging sign. We do shorter pieces on the web as well as longer pieces in the magazine. We do videos and we do, all sorts of multimedia, I guess is my other answer.
It's a very short, optimistic example. So 2 years ago, I was at a meeting of some Russian activists and Facebook people, and it was completely off the record, all this kind of stuff. And finally, there was a guy from Facebook who said, look, if you want to be successful on YouTube, our advice as a company is to make your video of 20 seconds actually length. And a year passed, and all of a sudden we got this big explosion of YouTube, political YouTube. We got lots of videos and which are viewed by millions of people. and they are extremely long, like 40 minutes, 55 minutes. They're extremely boring, even on my test. But they are extremely popular. So actually, even these global platforms, they do not know what they are talking about.
And I would like to defend Twitter a little bit. We discussed that yesterday in our Barcamp group. I think complexity of the argument is not tied to the length of the text, and I think that following a longer thought does not necessarily mean long-form essays. When I read a book by someone, it feels like there's some closure to it. I read the book, I done my bit, but actually following the same person on Twitter for 5 years and reading their arguments bit by bit again and again every day teaches me a lot more than this one book might have done, even though the book is maybe 300 pages and is long-form journalism. So
maybe you're reading the wrong book.
No, I mean, following someone for 5 years is a form of a long attention span.
But also you're seeing with tweets, these kind of aggregated tweets where people do 1 of 10. And I think that's really interesting in terms of a trend, because there's a really interesting barrister that I follow on Twitter, and he's been sort of doing his argument in a series of 20 tweets. So he obviously sees the need to expand from the original one, and it's, and you see more, I think you're seeing more of that way of using Twitter, but to expand on your argument.
So, thank you all for your long attention span this afternoon. There's coffee upstairs now, even more, and I think Philip has a small announcement, maybe that there's coffee upstairs.
Yes, there is coffee upstairs. No. So, first of all, I would like to thank the panelists and Daniel for this great panel.
Thank you.
Who needs coffee if we have this kind of discussion?